conditions had set out in the National Wage Agreement, the 14th round.
Now, the English put a price on his head, dead or alive, which finally rose to £10,000. Under this crushing strain, he became a very heavy cigarette smoker, and then suddenly stopped smoking completely, explaining to his awed sister Katie, "I was becoming a slave to cigarettes, I'll be a slave to nothing."
And then, on November the 11th, 1918, Germany surrendered and the First World War was over, and England prepared to turn her imperial might in full against the Irish people. The Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, was dead keen. He referred to the Irish volunteers as either murder gangs or rats. Not baboons, as far as I know. But before he could get his military hopes underway, the English government called for a general election on December the 14th, 1918, for the Parliament at Westminster, London. And the cheeky Sinn Féiners, which was the political arm of the Irish Volunteers, decided to contest every single parliamentary seat in Ireland, and out of the 105 seats, they won 73. And then these 73 elected Sinn Féin members of Parliament ignored Westminster and coolly formed a government of their own. And then, under the guns of the English army, on the 21st of January 1919, convened an Irish Parliament called the Dáil Éireann here at this Mansion House, Dublin. Great crowds gathered there, and the world's press was here. What could the poor old English do? It was very embarrassing for a country that had talked so loud and long about freedom and democracy. And worse, hadn't England claimed, amongst other things, that she'd gone to war against Germany to prevent that bully country from even marching across gallant little Belgium? A monstrous lie on England's part, but now potentially very embarrassing. I mean, how could England now march roughshod across gallant little Ireland? And contrary to the will of the majority of the Irish people, eh? Anyway, 27 Irish delegates entered this Mansion House, Dublin. The public rose in emotional response. A prayer opened the proceedings. And when the roll was called, the clerk answered for the majority of those absent. Imprisoned by the English, a declaration of independence was read, and a great concourse of people wept. But it was a depleted gathering. 36 of the elected members of Parliament were at that moment in English prisons. Karl Brewer delivered the opening address in the Irish language. Michael Collins and Harry Boland couldn't be present. They were helping Eamon de Valera to escape from Lincoln Prison in England, which they succeeded in doing. And incidentally, de Valera was voted President of the new Republic of Ireland. And Michael Collins was appointed Minister of Home Affairs. And about that cabinet rank, he remarked, "Our appointment simply ensured the hanging that was only probable had we remained merely members of the Dáil, the Parliament." But then added, "Whether we achieve our object or whether we fail gloriously, a mark has been made that cannot be effaced." And so, with the world looking on, and in particular the United States of America, England almost seemed to accept the Irish Parliament. But suddenly President Woodrow Wilson of the USA refused to support Ireland's entry into the First World War Peace Conference, and England recognized the weakening of Ireland's powerful friend and promptly threw against Ireland a terrible military force. On September the 10th, 1919, England suppressed the Irish Parliament, the Dáil. Lloyd George, Welsh Prime Minister in England, organised the terror against Ireland. First he sent in the usual spies and informers, and then he sent in an independent volunteer army known as the Auxiliaries. The Auxiliaries, incidentally, were one of Winston Churchill's jolly ideas. They were comparable to Nazi SS troops. They were well-paid ex-British officers, and their motto was to shoot first and ask questions afterwards. They fought hard and efficiently. They also murdered and tortured freely, and the Welshman Lloyd George and the Englishman Winston Churchill turned a couple of blind eyes. Next, Lloyd George and his government sent into Ireland an army called the Black and Tans. Now, it is usually believed that many of these Black and Tans were convicted criminals before leaving England. What is certain is that most of them were worthy of criminal conviction before they left Ireland. The Irish, admiring English efficiency, tended to prefer the barbarism of the Auxiliaries to the obscenities of the Black and Tans. Michael Collins began his work against this new and terrible onslaught by destroying the English spy system. He was able to do this because no Irishman would betray him or dare to betray him. At this time, a Mrs. Lee Doyle was walking across this famous O'Connell Bridge openly with her friend Michael Collins, when to her astonishment, a policeman, rejecting the £10,000 reward, saluted Michael Collins, smiled and said, "Good day, sir." Michael Collins agreed with Mrs. Doyle that this was the queer thingeen. He protected himself by an open, innocent, boyish charm. And of course, the English force didn't know what he looked like, and no one was going to tell them. Michael Collins rode his bicycle through Dublin's fair city every day, organizing the fighting that flared from one end of Ireland to the other. With that £10,000 dead or alive on his head, he lived in an endless series of rooms. This was one of his rooms in Vaughan's Hotel, Dublin. Incidentally, I am told that he had about 100 alternative keys for his various lodgings throughout Dublin. This was one of his exits, through the roof. But sometimes he lived with brave families, particularly the family of Mr. and Mrs. Bat O'Connor. Mrs. O'Connor recalled going through her house in the early hours of one morning to check that all was locked and safe. She noticed that the bedroom door of the room where Michael Collins was sleeping with his friend Harry Boland was open. She looked in and saw the two men asleep, but their bare arms were resting on two small side tables, and their hands were touching two revolvers. Michael Collins had a great capacity for love. It seems that his greatest happiness was to be with children, in whom he placed total trust, and that trust was never broken. Though he was a great hero, the O'Connor children never mentioned at school that Michael Collins lived in their house. He fell in love with at least 3 women during his life, but was a stoic on that subject. One of the ladies once remarked to him that if a woman discovered that her fiancé had an incurable disease, she had the right to call the wedding off. Michael Collins simply picked up his hat and left the room, and as far as I know, never saw her again. But you can see Michael Collins with old people. Great age holds something for me that is awesome. I am much fonder of old people in the darkness than I am of young people in the daylight. Mick Collins set up his intelligence organization here in Crow Street, calling it the Irish Products Company. Unhappily, no one now seems to know what became of it. Dublin Castle, the old sick heart of English power,
is 200 yards up the road.
He organized his own men inside this Dublin castle. In here, a young detective named Ned Broy typed many of the